friends, welcome to another episode of Deep True Crime. And during the trial, they were shared how the killer ambushed Paul before shooting Maggie on her knees as she fled. And this comes as a shocking allegation against Alex, right? Alex Murdaugh allegedly ambushed his son, Paul, in the feeding room of the dog kennels before turning on his wife Maggie, who tried to flee only to be shot and killed on her knees, according to chilling testimony from a top crime scene expert. Dr. Kenny Kinsey, an Orangeburg County Sheriff's deputy and crime scene expert, gave a graphic testimony in Culleton County Courthouse in Walterboro, South Carolina, today, where he walked jurors through each moment of the June 7th horrific 2021 attack. Expected to be one of the last witnesses for the prosecution, he went into intricate detail about the victims' final terrifying moments, including each of the gunshots they suffered, where the gunman stood while firing each shot. And I probably should say that, my friends, this is gonna get graphic, so here is your warning. Beware, be careful. This is not for the faint of heart, so make sure you're over 18 before you proceed, and make sure that you can handle this type of stuff. Paul was shot twice with a shotgun, while his mother was shot 5 times with an AR-15 style rifle. The guns have never been found. And based on Dr. Kinsey's analysis of the crime scene, jurors heard that Paul was caught off guard in the feeding room of the dog kennels and had no time to defend himself. After killing Paul, the gunman then left the feeding room and approached Maggie outside. In her final terrifying moments, she faced her killer and backed away, knocking into the family's ATV before being gunned down by her killer. She was struck twice before falling to her knees, at which point the killer shot her twice in the head. Mr. Murdaugh is accused of killing his wife and son to distract from his string of alleged financial crimes at a time when his multi-million-dollar fraud scheme was on the brink of being exposed. Mr. Murdaugh, the once powerful heir to a South Carolina legal dynasty, has pleaded not guilty and claims the killer or killers is still at large. That's what he is sharing. During the detailed and harrowing testimony from Dr. Kinsey, Mr. Murdaugh was seen sobbing and wiping his eyes in the courtroom. Dr. Kinsey said that Paul was standing in the middle of the 10-feet long feeding room of the dog kennels when the killer fired the first shot. His arms were not raised, indicating that he may have been ambushed by the gunman, who was standing outside the room in the doorway looking in. The first shot, which struck Paul in the chest and arm, was not fatal. The 22-year-old remained standing for several moments, as seen in the blood droplets that Dr. Kinsey said flowed down his arm and dripped off his fingers onto the ground. He then moved slowly towards the door of the feeding room and towards his killer, leaving a bloody footprint in the ground. And this is where, like I said, this is not for the faint of heart, so proceed at your own risk here. But this is an image of the feeding room of the dog kennels where Paul was ambushed and shot by the killer. And the killer is said to have then moved slowly towards the door of the feeding room and towards his killer. That's Paul moving slowly towards the door of the feeding room and towards his killer, leaving a bloody footprint in the ground as he went. As he reached the door frame, he was shot a second time. At that point, Dr. Kinsey said the shooter was standing to the right of the doorway and fired upwards, with the bullet traveling up through Paul's shoulder and into his brain. This second shot was fatal, causing Paul to immediately fall forward, landing outside the feeding room. When he received this wound, he ceased all movement. That's what Dr. Kinsey shared, adding any movement would be due to gravity. Jurors were shown graphic crime scene photos of spatters of Paul's blood, biological matter, and hair on the door of the feeding room. Biological matter could also have sprayed on the shooter if they were close to the muzzle of the firearm. The crime scene expert testified that there was no way the gunshot wounds were self-inflicted and no way that the shooter fired them from above. He also said that the shots were not fired at point-blank range. Dr. Kinsey went on to testify about the gunshot wounds to Maggie, revealing that the gunman fired multiple shots from an AR-15 style rifle in very quick succession, as she appeared to be facing the direction of the feeding. Based on the angle of the gunshots, the shooter was standing around 4 or 5 feet away when he first opened fire. The first 2 or 3 shots, the first striking Maggie's upper thigh and the second passing through her abdomen and exiting around her kidneys, were not fatal. Though not fatal, she would have suffered and fell to the ground. That's what Dr. Kinsey has shared. In a demonstration acted out in the courtroom by Prosecutor Creighton Waters, Maggie fell onto her knees with at least one hand on the ground when the gunman then shot down on her. The next shot through the left side of her abdomen, up through her breast, her jaw, and into her brain was fatal. The second shot, also to her head and making one big injury, would also have been fatal, but she was already dead. Maggie fell face down on the ground, he said, and there is no evidence that her body was manipulated or moved over. When asked if the angle of the gunshots were consistent with the shooter coming from the feeding room after killing Paul, Dr. Kinsley said, "It certainly could be." Jurors were also shown a photo of an impression on the back of Maggie's calf, an impression that Mr. Murdaugh's attorney have brought up at the trial. Dr. Kinsey revealed that he compared the impression to the tire on the ATV under the hanger next to Maggie's body. The impression matched the tire, and mud from the tire was also found on Maggie's leg. And that's where it's like, hearing this, you have to know how horrible this is, right? I mean, the impression matched the tire, and mud from the tire was also found on Maggie's leg. Dr. Kinsey, that's what he was sharing, that is a tire tread impression. That is my opinion. That's what he said. It is most likely that tire on the ATV. If it is not that tire, it is a similar tire with the same specific tread design. Dr. Kinsey testified that it was consistent with Maggie's backing into the tire. At some point in time, Maggie Murdaugh made contact with the tire, he said. "I saw no evidence that she was run over, so she had to make contact with it at some point." Dr. Kinsey testified that there was also no evidence of any struggle between Paul or Maggie and the shooter, and the victims had no defensive wound. The crime scene expert also testified about the location of Paul's cell phone, which was found resting on the right back pocket of his trousers. Dr. Kinsey told jurors that the phone had been placed there by someone else. Who could that someone else be? In my opinion, his phone was placed there by someone else. That's what the doctor said. After the fatal shot, there was no movement. There's no way Paul could have retrieved the phone from his pocket and put on his pants. If he had it in his hand, it would not have landed there. In my opinion, it would have fallen to the ground. It wouldn't have fell and landed behind him, up in the air and on. In the 911 call reporting the murders, Mr. Murdaugh had told the dispatcher that he moved his son to check for signs of life and his phone had popped out of his pocket. He claimed he picked it up and then put it back down. And during a tense cross-examination, defense attorney Dick Harpootlian, he questioned the location of the shooter when Paul was shot, pulling out a protractor to make his point that it is an unusual angle. That's what they are sharing. And you can see Mr. Richard Harpootlian right here in this picture. He's the one that questioned the location of the shooter when Paul was shot, pulling out a protractor to make his point that it is an unusual angle. And at one point, Dr. Kinsey pushed back on his line of questioning, saying, "I've got a feeling you're fooling with me, Mr. Harpootlian." When Mr. Harpootlian responded, You got that feeling? I've got that feeling. That's what the defense attorney had said. Now, the prosecution, the brutal murder, the double murders brought to light a series of scandals surrounding Mr. Murdaugh, including unexplained deaths, the multi-million fraud scheme, everything that I've shared, even a botched hitman plot. At the time of the murders, as I shared, Paul was awaiting trial over the death of Mallory Beach because of an accident on the boat that he was driving. And this is the boat that Paul was driving when he drunkenly crashed, killing Mallory Beach. Now, Paul, he was allegedly drunk driving the boat at the time and crashed it, throwing Mallory Beach overboard. Her body washed ashore a week later. Paul was charged with multiple felonies over the boat wreck and was facing 25 years in prison at the time of his murder. And the Beach family, they sued Mr. Murdaugh, and a lawsuit hearing was scheduled for the weeks of the murders. It was postponed following Maggie and Paul's murders. You can see how the timing on all of this is also not looking good for Mr. Alex. Days on from the shootings, an investigation was then reopened into the 2015 death of Stephen Smith, who was found dead in the middle of the road in Hampton County. And here you can see Gloria Satterfield, as I shared earlier, that, this is where they even reopened this investigation into this mysterious death that was connected to him. This is the longtime housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield. She died in 2018 in a mystery trip and fall accident at the family home. Now, Mr. Murdaugh then allegedly stole around $4 million in a wrongful death settlement from her son. Then, 3 months on, Mr. Murdaugh was suddenly shot in the head along the side of a road, which then later found out was his cousin, Smith, that did that, Mr. Smith. And so that's when a lot of things, he survived that and called 911 claiming that he was ambushed in a drive-by shooting while he was changing a tire on his vehicle. But that story about the incident quickly unraveled. 1 week later, on September 13, he confessed to law enforcement that he had orchestrated the whole saga, paying an alleged hitman to shoot and kill him in an assisted suicide plot so that his surviving son Buster could get a $10 million life insurance windfall. That's why it's like, doesn't look good overall at all in a lot of this, because even this right here, after the shooting, an investigation was then reopened into the 2015 death of Stephen Smith, who is pictured here. He is the one that was found dead in the middle of the road in Hampton County. The openly gay teenager, rest in peace, only 19 years old. He had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and his death was officially ruled a hit and run. But the victim's family have long doubted this version of events, with the Murdaugh name cropping up in several police tips and community rumors. So it literally was all going downhill. And so when he confessed to the drive-by, he told investigators that he had paid Curtis Eddie Smith, a former law firm client, distant cousin, and allegedly his drug dealer, to carry out the shooting. Both he and Mr. Smith were then arrested and charged over that incident. And now the plot, described as the side of the road incident, marked one of the most bizarre twists in the sprawling scandal, which has enveloped the disgraced heir to the prominent South Carolina legal dynasty over the past almost 2 years. And Mr. Murdaugh, now he's facing life in prison for the murders of his wife and son, and then all the other stuff that is to come after that. So not looking good at all. My friends, that's the whole purpose I do this, so to keep you aware of what could go wrong in this crazy world we live in. Because it is a crazy world we live in. Until next time, my friends, be safe, be careful, be alert, be aware. Because this is a crazy world. Have a good one. Peace.